everybody. Welcome to another video on HVSBL podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor James McGrath, and we're going to be talking a little bit about John the Baptist, Baptist sources, stuff like that. So you presented that SBL about the something about a Protoevangelium regarding John the Baptist, and that has to do with Baptist source material. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So there's an early Christian source known as the Protoevangelium or Infancy Gospel of James. And it's a fascinating text, probably came into existence sometime during the 2nd century. So one of our early post-New Testament sources. And it tells a story of, in its present form at least, of Mary's parents, who are named Joachim and Anna, and then the miraculous conception of Mary, and has some things about Mary and Joseph, a little bit about Jesus, Herod, the wise men, and then suddenly at the end it does this out of the blue right turn and focuses entirely on John the Baptist. Jesus drops out, his family drops out, and we're told that Herod was looking for John. And Elizabeth knew this, and so she fled into the wilderness, and then Herod is seeking the son of Zechariah, and so sends word to Zechariah, mentions that his son is to be is to rule over Israel. And scholars have long puzzled over this and said, what on earth is this? Where does this come from? And the dominant viewpoint has been that this is a fragment of a Baptist source that's taken from somewhere else and stuck onto the end of this Christian source. And my presentation suggests an alternative, because if that's the only explanation we can come up with, it's better than suggesting that a Christian wrote this and said, let's drop Jesus out of the picture and suggest that John's going to be king instead, right? So that seems to come clearly from a Baptist source, but what's it doing on the end of this? And why does it seem to dovetail so naturally here, right? Because Herod gives the order, slaughter the children, and then suddenly it's Elizabeth knew they were searching for John. And so what I suggest is that rather than this being an odd appendage stuck on the end of a Christian source, taken from a Baptist source that just happened to seem like a continuation of the same story, that what we have here is what has sometimes been called editorial fatigue, right? So at this point, rather than it being strange other source material that's brought in, this is a source that the author's been reworking throughout this Protoevangelium or Infancy Gospel of James. And here it's peeking through more clearly, right? And so what I suggest is that actually the Protoevangelium is based on a Baptist source, a source that was focused on John the Baptist. And just entertaining that possibility based on that ending, we go back to the beginning, and it gives us a different perspective on something that you probably would have noticed anyway, that Joachim and Anna, there's an elderly couple, they can't have children, there's stuff to do with whether he gets to offer sacrifice because he's doesn't have children, and they remind you a lot of Zechariah and Elizabeth from the Gospel of Luke. And so the possibility that this is in fact a reworked story originally about John the Baptist, reworked to be about Mary, with bits from the Gospels that we know from the New Testament also woven in order to create a new story, seems like an alternative that should be considered. And as far as I've been able to find, nobody had suggested that before.
How does one go about telling when editorial fatigue is going on? And really, what is editorial fatigue?
Right. So it's a term that has been introduced to refer to an author using a source and adapting it, and then at some point they forget the way they've been adapting it and reworking it and changing its meaning, and include something that made sense in the context of the original source, the source that they're using, and doesn't make sense in the context of the reworking. And the classic example that's used of this is Matthew's Gospel using Mark's story of Herod Antipas executing John the Baptist. In the Gospel of Mark, we're told that Herod Antipas didn't want to kill John. He feared him, he was puzzled by him, he liked to listen to him, and Herodias wants John dead because of his criticisms of her husband and her marriage to him and things like that. And so then you get the dancing girl, the counsel from the mother, the request for John the Baptist's head on a platter. And then the story in Mark tells us the king was sad. But because of the vow, because of the guests, he granted it. In Matthew's gospel, Matthew starts the story in a much more plausible way and says, Antipas wanted to kill John, right? Josephus says the same thing, right? That's much more historically plausible. Mark seems to be wanting to shift the blame onto the women. So Matthew is adapting the story and saying that Herod Antipas wanted to kill John. Yet when he reaches that moment after the request for John's head on a platter, he nonetheless says the king was sad. And the best explanation for that is Matthew has included this detail from Mark's story and has forgotten, oh, I rewrote it, and so I needed to change this in order for this to be consistent, right? And so editorial fatigue means in the process of editing the source, reworking the source, got tired supposedly in the process. And I think it would be more accurate to say that Matthew may have been focusing so much on rewording Mark and adjusting Mark's wording that he wasn't paying as close attention to the details of the story and how it all fit together. But that's probably the classic example, and there it's used to determine the relationship between two written sources, right? Because Matthew and Mark are so similar that there has to be literary dependence. The only question was who borrowed from whom. Mm-hmm. What I tried to do in the case of the infancy gospel of James was to say, okay, if we have what looks like editorial fatigue in a text and we don't have the source, can we nonetheless discern some characteristics of the source because of this phenomenon of editorial fatigue?
What is the Baptist source? Is it a hypothetical source that's hypothesized to explain these different Baptist traditions you're talking about?
Yeah. Yes. So when I talk about the Baptist source, I'm not talking about like Southern Baptist or American Baptist, just to be clear. Talking about something produced by followers of John the Baptist. And on the one hand, its oldest form is hypothetical. On the other hand, at the very least, the ending of the infancy gospel of James has a piece of it. That scholars agree on. The Gospel of Luke seems to draw on Baptist infancy traditions, right? Has some very distinctive material. And in the Mandaean book of John, we also have some material which relates to these other ones, right? So we have Zechariah and Elizabeth. We have signs and portents preceding the birth of a son to them in their old age. And so we have a number of texts that actually do record Baptist infancy stories. And so that we know that there were such things. This is more about the possibility that we can detect a different and or earlier form of that source material underlying what in its present form is a Christian gospel about Mary, and then ultimately Jesus also comes into the picture.
And what about the Mandaean Book of John? Does that provide any assistance in giving us a better insight into the Baptist source and ultimately into the historical John the Baptist?
Yeah, so the view I hold on Mandaean sources is, at least for the time being, a controversial one. What happened in the history of use of Mandaean sources in the study of the New Testament was that for a while there were scholars who plugged them in as background material. These texts seem to come from followers of John the Baptist. The Gospel of John, the Gospel of Luke, and Acts seem to be arguing against followers of John the Baptist. And so plugged these sources in as background very uncritically. And it was not inappropriate that there be a backlash against that, but now they're largely ignored. And in my recent book, John of History, Baptist of Faith, I make the case that we need to use them in a more balanced way, right? So plugging in rabbinic Judaism as background to the New Testament, anachronistic. These texts are from much later. A lot of misinterpretation of the New Testament based on that. But they're not irrelevant. And just ignoring them as though they didn't very often make clear that they're embedding some very old traditions and some things that can clarify things that were going on in New Testament times, ignoring them is not the answer, just because there's been uncritical misuse of them. And so in the case of the Mandaean Book of John, we have something that I think shows beyond a doubt that there is old ancient material embedded in this. Right? John is made to say things that don't make sense in the context of later Gnostic Mandaeism. there are close connections with the Gospel of Luke and the traditions in it, and yet doesn't seem to know the Gospel of Luke. Certainly doesn't know it in Greek or in Syriac, and yet converges on some phrasing and other things that also show up in Luke. And so I think a strong case can be made, not that it is the original ancient version of the Nativity of John the Baptist, but that it derives from it. It evolves out of it. And so what I'm trying to do is less the older sort of thing where you're trying to find the exact words of a very, very small bit of saying, but to triangulate back, right? Because what happens in storytelling and folklore is you get lots of different versions of the same story. It's like telling jokes, right? Where the characters change and the punchlines change and people adapt things and they tell the story longer and sometimes and folklore is like that and storytelling is like that. And so what we can do is, if we have lots of versions of something, we can sometimes see them as all ripples from some earlier impact. And that's what I'm trying to do, to get back and to see what might the contours of this ancient narrative have been like.
Well, thank you for joining me today, James McGrath.
It's been a pleasure, as always, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.